Welcome to Washington in Focus, your source for the week's top stories in the state of Washington. I'm Cole Lauterbach, managing editor for the Center Square Newswire service. This week, we'll be discussing the real driver behind Washington's budget deficit, a directive from California that could mean chaos for Washington's truck and RV industries, Seattle putting together a razor-thin budget on the margins, and cities across Washington asking state lawmakers to let them increase property taxes beyond the current maximum. That's ahead on Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach.
They're simple, boring, never thought of until they're needed. They're windshield wipers. Only when Mary Anderson became annoyed that New York trolley drivers were stopping to wipe their windshield by hand did anybody do something about it. By attaching a spring-loaded arm to a rubber blade, one woman made travel easier and safer. Look to innovate and pass it on. From passiton.com.
Welcome back to Washington in Focus. I'm Cole Lauterbach. Now let's jump into the headlines. Public officials aren't typically too inclined to make themselves available to talk about budget deficits. But in Washington, readers are seeing headlines on a near daily basis about how the state's revenues are down. Always curious fellow investigative reporter TJ Martinell looked into state finances and found that some revenue is down, but there's another issue. What'd you find, TJ?
Well, what I found is actually the one thing that is important to note is that what's reduced is the expected revenue. So the Economic Revenue Forecast Council does forecasts that's necessary for budgeting because our state's not allowed to spend more money than it's forecasted to bring in during a 4-year period. So they lowered the expected revenue, but yet if you look at the actual numbers of the revenue that's come in, it's higher than it's pretty much ever been. We don't have the full results for this year, but I was looking at, compared to say 2019 or even 10 years ago, some of these revenue streams have seen 131% increases in a handful of years.
Now, we're looking at, and it seems like when looking backwards at statistics and population migration and things like that of a governmental nature, everything has an asterisk on it from 2020 to 2022, 2023, even in some situations. Because for the most part, one, the pandemic completely and the related closures of businesses upended the economy. And two, the pandemic aid sent billions and billions and billions of dollars to state, county, municipal governments and offered them this massive sugar rush of revenue. But it was well known and understood that it was not going to be a permanent federal subsidy moving forward. But in those couple years, we were seeing record budgets everywhere at all levels of government. Is that the case in Washington? And now that revenue is drying up that came from Washington, D.C., we're seeing a right sizing? Or is it just that revenue had grown locally?
So with the way our state budget works, I look at the budget from the perspective of state revenue because there's kind of two different state budgets. There's the combined budget, and that's where you have federal funding for stuff. And then there's the state budget that's based solely on state revenue. The state revenue-based budget is higher than it's ever been. As far as the combined amount, it was probably highest I didn't actually look at that number. But what was interesting is the Senate Ways and Means Chair, June Robinson, was reacting to the latest revenue forecast. And one could read into it where she's saying something like that, where our spending before was the result of COVID and now we're post-pandemic. Again, she doesn't say anything to where it's explicit, but she points out that a lot of decisions were made during the pandemic to help, businesses and the schools survive. And now they're looking at building different types of budgets. She says, quote, without COVID overshadowing every decision. So she also says we need a right-sized government to fit our post-COVID reality. Now, what that means, I don't know. And people can interpret it, but that's one possible interpretation is that she's saying the spending back then was the result of COVID and that money either isn't there anymore or the need for it isn't there. But we'll have to find out when, they start writing the budget in, early next year.
Right. Under a new governor of all things as well. And as we've seen, when new governors come in, they typically like to, like any new manager, they like to come in and, make their mark and have their own specific programs that they can point to that they did for the inevitable election cycle that's coming up in, 3.5 years. But her quote, for a Democrat to say those things, it was obviously very couched language, as you said, but because, when you're on the same team, state officials, when they want to say something like that, they don't necessarily want to be too blunt because they'll rock the boat, I would say, is probably the best way of putting it. But she certainly does hint at what you're saying. Now, in addition to revenue being, even slightly down, but we've also, in the state of Washington, you're seeing this is one of the first years of all of these new revenue streams, correct?
Yeah. So the capital gains tax, they started collections last year and it brought in $847 million. So that alone is just a new revenue stream. You had the property tax, which increased by a significant amount. You had one of the interesting ones was the estate tax. It increased from $366 million in 2022 to $847 million in 2023 alone. So a 131% increase. Was that the result of people dying during COVID or businesses who own business? That alone maybe warrants looking into further. But you had just a lot of these taxes increased. And I think that's what's going to be interesting about the discussions around this, because in contrast, back during the Great Recession, they were facing similar budget deficits, but they were due to revenue streams declining very significantly. I mean, the real estate excise tax collapsed as a result of the housing bubble bursting. And so they were faced with a situation where they didn't have so much of a spending problem per se, but they had a revenue decrease from what was their regular spending levels. In this case, you're not seeing revenue drop. So it's really, and we've already seen some lawmakers call for new taxes. Obviously, Senator Robinson didn't do that. But that's going to be the interesting fight, is over, do we cut spending or do we raise more taxes? But we're talking about a potential $10 billion to $12 billion revenue deficit. So it may be a combination of, we're going to cut like a couple billion here, and then we're going to raise some a couple billion more here. Maybe they introduce a new tax, or they raise lower the threshold for the capital gains tax, or they change the property, whatever it is. They're facing a very different situation than compared to the Great Recession.
Right. Be it wars, pandemic, any type of emergency. The former Chicago mayor, Rahm Emanuel, who was also the chief of staff for President Obama, said, and it's a very infamous quote now, is never let a crisis go to waste. And you're seeing little hat tips here and there of saying, well, we're posing this as a revenue shortfall, and what we're going to do is create this image of crisis and say, look, we don't have any other options. We have to fund these critical units of government, and we have to raise revenue. We have to increase taxes, otherwise. And the old saying is, typically they hold up children, the elderly, firefighters, police. If we don't increase revenue, these are what goes away. And it becomes the most vital units of government, the most vital services that our tax dollars pay for. Those are always held up as the first thing to go. Now, TJ, you did get others calling for a little bit of a reframing of the conversation, saying that this isn't necessarily as much a revenue problem is an unwillingness to right size spending.
Yeah. So there's the Economic Revenue Forecast Council Chair, Linda Wilson. She put out a statement that said, well, one, she noted that state economic growth would be slow, meaning it's growing, it's just not growing as fast. But she thinks that there's enough projected revenue to cover and balance the 2025-2027 operating budget that maintains services and programs right now. She says a lot of this new debt, this deficit, is what she described as $4 billion tied to new collective bargaining agreements with state workers. So in other words, they're trying to increase salaries, benefits, or just cost to government as part of these collective bargaining agreements. And if you don't approve of them, then the deficit goes away in many cases.
Yeah. Will be fascinating to watch as we follow this conversation and see how this crisis, so they call it, unfolds. Thank you, TJ. Washington state officials decided a few years back to align with much of California's governmental policies in terms of environmental regulations. The latest edict from Sacramento could see sales of gas-powered semi-trucks and RVs become largely non-existent due to a specific type of quota. Capitol correspondent Carlene Johnson has more on this. What exactly is going to happen on July 1st regarding this, Carlene?
A little background first, Cole. As of 2005, states in the U.S. had to make a decision. They would adopt federal emission standards for vehicles of all types or adopt California's stricter emissions restrictions. So what do you suppose Washington did? You might imagine Washington did adopt California's rules in 2020, and that's locked in for good unless we go back and change some things dramatically. So that mandate is basically an increasing percentage of zero emission vehicles, whether that's electric or hydrogen. And that's for all vehicles, not just for, cars and light trucks, but, motorhomes, RVs, and eventually, our freight haulers as well. And as of October 23rd, the California Air Resources Board, they're the ones that basically make these rules, right? How many more EVs do we have to have on the roads? They amended what are called their ACT standards, and that stands for Advanced Clean Trucks Standards. And that requires manufacturers to sell a certain percentage of zero emission vehicles, ZEVs, and the targets now for the big trucks as of the beginning of the year, which Washington also has to go with, are anywhere from 4% to 7% of all new sales of these big rigs have to be these zero emission vehicles.
Now, what happens then? I mean, because what you're saying is essentially that they must find buyers for these, products before they can actually sell gas-powered semi-trucks and RVs, which are obviously much more popular. What then happens if a dealership is, they hit March and they've sold one, electrified semi-truck and they've got orders for 30 gas-powered trucks? What do they do?
Right. And that's where there's some gray area here because according to, Washington Department of Ecology, there is going to be some wiggle room. Their response to me in working on this story was to say, no, they're going to have a little bit of time. They won't first have to meet the zero, emission vehicles targets before they can sell diesel vehicles, on their lot. But that's not at all what the legislation says, according to the CARB, the California Air Resources Board. That's not what that says. And if Washington has in fact adopted those, and perhaps ecology now is going back and giving some wiggle room. The big problem is, they can't even find these vehicles to purchase.
Yeah.
They're so much more expensive. I mean, Tesla the last couple of years has come out with the cheapest of the big freight haulers that are electric vehicle haulers. There's like anywhere from $200,000 to $250,000. There's not a ton of them out there on the road. You can't find them. And not only that, none of the haulers in Washington state at this point seem to really want them because we don't have the infrastructure for them. Where are you going to go and charge this vehicle when you're driving across I-90 on your way to Idaho, Montana, and beyond? And, you've gone your 250 miles and you've got to stop and charge up. Where's your big charging depot? They have those in California. They don't have those big truck hauler charging depots in Washington, certainly not Idaho or Montana, right? Where they haven't adopted these stricter standards. So the infrastructure is not there. The demand isn't there. So the Washington State Trucking Association is saying, please, give us some more time. There's no way we can meet these, these mandates come first of the year.
Yeah. And the big thing about this too, that even if, if you're not an over the road truck driver or own a trucking company or a dealership, this will reach out and touch you, because everything you find on a store shelf and much of what you get delivered to you via Amazon is showing up at those distribution centers and those grocery stores and apparel, stores, those outlets. Those are all showing up on trucks. And if those trucks are not able to be replaced by, what these trucking companies do is they have leasing agreements with dealerships that are settled and planned years ahead because of an expectation that they will hit a certain mileage by that time. If that gets disrupted, you will see either a lack of available things, or you will see those available things become much, much more expensive.
Yeah. I mean, sort of a microcosm of that, if you will, was, 2117, the Climate Commitment Act here in Washington. We saw what that did with gas prices, absolutely impacted the price of, goods and services and everything else, not just filling up your gas tank, but, when you go to Walmart to buy a loaf of bread, everything is more expensive. And then you think about this too, the gal at the Trucking Association, Sherry Call, who's the CEO, she told me, she said, even at a fast charge, assuming we do have the infrastructure for these big trucks, even at a fast charge, it takes an hour and a half to charge up one of these big trucks. So you've got this hauler who's stopped on I-90 or I-82 or 395 or wherever in Eastern Washington, sitting there for 90 minutes charging versus stopping for, 20 minutes at the Love Truck station to fuel up and get a hot dog. Huge capacity loss. And so you're absolutely right. That's going to get passed on for goods and services, makes everything more expensive. Yep.
It will end up as a disruption that we will definitely track. Thank you, Carlene. The city of Seattle has a budget. After facing revenue shortfalls compared to their current spending for months, city officials say they put together a spending plan that leaves them out of the red. Seattle reporter Spencer Pauly covered the meetings. How'd they manage to come up with an even number, Spencer?
Well, Cole, the main thing is that there's about 70 layoffs throughout all city departments that helped cut down some of the gap there. But ultimately, the city's jumpstart payroll tax is plugging the rest of that $270-some million gap. Now, this tax is essentially, the jumpstart payroll tax is essentially paid by, your companies like Amazon, Google, and Meta. And it's expected to collect $520 million this year. Massive.
That's a good chunk of money. And like you said, it relies on just a few companies, making it potentially a very volatile tax, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's, this is a tax that's kind of forced companies like Amazon to kind of move past over on the other side of Lake Washington over to Bellevue. But still, bringing in a lot of revenue, and about $287 million of that is being used in the general fund. Now, this has caused some issues, with some of the community members, nonprofit rely on the payroll tax. Huh?
Yeah. You had protests, right?
There was protests just inside City Hall within the lobby that I've gone to. And this is from nonprofits that rely on the payroll tax. Now, for some background information, Cole, the Jumpstart payroll tax, the spending plan allowed collected revenue to be used towards your initiatives such as like the Green New Deal, affordable housing, and mental health initiatives. But in the first year that tax was in effect, it brought in more money than it was anticipated. And I think, when that happens, city council members and, city officials look and say, well, this could be a better use for this money, right?
They see dollar signs, yes. Now, Spencer, will the city have similar budget challenges after 2026? Because it seems like this is a lot of... the way it's being described and the way that you had it appears to be a lot of this stuff is, I wouldn't say one-time spending, but it seems like Band-Aids.
It's definitely, the Band-Aid's probably the best way to describe this. Seattle City Council member Dan Strauss has continued to say among this budget process that the city's in the middle of the storm, and there's much more to come. This is all based off this recent revenue forecast that came amid the budget process, in which the revenues are lower than expected. And basically, even though this general fund is being pumped with the payroll tax in the future, there's still going to be a $75 million deficit And that's going to cause more problems. We're going to see more layoffs potentially in 2027. And that's why we're seeing Seattle City Council members propose more progressive forms of revenue, saying we need all the help we can get.
Right.
It's just allowing us to start to fall.
As compared to what the situation TJ described at a state level, I mean, you followed this enough now where it appears that the cuts are definitely, the spending restraint is definitely happening to a certain level in Seattle. And they're saying it likely to get worse as these Band-Aids no longer stop the bleeding. But we'll see how severe and how serious Seattle officials are about spending restraint, which is, as you've seen for years now, is not typically their strong suit.
Right.
But thank you, Spencer. Appreciate it. A Washington state law from the 1970s restricts municipalities from increasing property taxes beyond a certain percent in any given year. It's looked at as a taxpayer protection. Now, over the years, that figure's fallen so that it can increase by an even smaller amount. Cities are now pushing lawmakers via their lobbying arm to let them blow past that threshold. Eastern Washington reporter Tim Klauser covered the request. Where was it in the age of disco that this threshold was originally?
Yeah, Cole, the state legislature first enacted its cap on annual property tax increases in 1973, and that was at 6%, which is far more than the currently 1% that's allowed, and more than double than what they're pushing, or about double what they're pushing for now. Now, it stayed at that 6% mark for about 30 years until an effort from Tim Eyman, former state Supreme Court Justice James Johnson, and former AG Rob McKenna pushed Initiative 747 through to success, which largely still stands, which cut that 6% cap down to 1%. Now, that resulted in a lot of loss in annual funding for the state, so they weren't too happy. A court struck it down in 2006, but the Supreme Court... it got struck down in 2006 with the Supreme Court upholding that. But later that same month of it being upheld, the state legislature got together and reinstated that 1% cap, which has stayed ever since.
Now, what do cities want?
Yeah, they want to take that 1% cap and raise it to 3%, which doesn't sound like too much, but it could be considerable over time. Now, it does align more with the U.S.'s historical inflation rate of about 3.3%. But jumping from 1% to 3% the next year, it's undoubtedly going to bring in quite a bit more money.
Yeah, you talk about percentages and you say, oh, well, it's just a 2 percentage point increase. But to the person paying the bill, that's a tripling of the potential increase. And at this point, I mean, if they're pushing for this right now and they're wanting this immediately, I don't think that there's any type of situation where if it were allowed to go to 3%, cities would not take that chance and take that opportunity to increase by the maximum amount to extract as much tax dollars as they possibly can. Now, is there a specific reason why cities are pushing for this now, or has this been a long-standing goal of the municipalities and the lobbying arm that they have in Olympia?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like Spencer and TJ alluded to earlier, a lot of cities across the state, with the legislature included, are gasping for more funding as their budgets sort of implode. I mean, like the rest of the country, Washington enjoyed its fair share of COVID-19 relief funding, around $11 billion actually just in this state alone. But there's not much left, and now municipalities need a way to bridge that gap created by using one-time funds for recurring expenses. Now, the association...
That seems to be the situation in Spokane, right?
Yeah. That's the situation in Spokane. Spencer spoke on it in Seattle as well. A lot of these cities around the state, I'm covering it in Yakima as well, are faced with these deficits. Now, they could cut and sort of right size, like you had mentioned with TJ earlier, but people are going to lose jobs. It's going to cut services, etc. A lot of places want to keep services intact as much as they can, and increasing the 1% cap to 3% could allow them to do that to a degree. But then again, you might run into issues down the road as these budgets just keep inflating faster than revenues can keep up.
Right. And, then we consistently see the situation where they come back to the state saying, well, now we want 5%. And now we want, 6%. Maybe, now there's another emergency and we really need to keep these services. So it'll likely end up being 7%. Tell me about the organization that is pushing for this on behalf of the municipalities of Washington?
Yeah, the Association of Washington Cities is really spearheading this movement. Now, they represent nearly all of Washington's 281 towns and cities. So they've got a lot of stake in the game. But it is worth noting that the AWC pushed for this last year, too. And it initially made it out of committee, but didn't make it all the way out of the House. So they're back trying to push for it again. And I think a lot of the state is sort of in a worse position in terms of budgeting than it was last year. So it might gain some more traction this year, but it's likely we'll see some debates over it.
All right. Well, it'll be a great thing to track and good for taxpayers to know as it goes along the legislative process. Thank you, Tim, and a big thank you to all of our journalists for sharing their stories. Stay up to date with these and more at thecentersquare.com. I'm Cole Lauterbach, and until next time, this has been Washington in Focus.